group of people referred to as mandingos. You see this term, I think, in Django Unchained, and it has like a different connotation in Django Unchained, if you've ever watched that movie. Here, I'm going to start recording. So yeah, he's kidnapped, he's put on this slave ship, and he's brought to, I think, New England. Who's writing Job's story? Is it actually Job who's recording these things?
Nope.
No. Who is it? Like, who's in charge of writing this guy's tale?
Crap, I forgot that part. Hold on.
Thomas Bluet?
Yeah. And so that's a white guy, right? Related, it's the story of Job related through this Thomas fellow. And it's a white guy. And so like one of the very first slave narratives we have is not from Job himself. It's about Job, but it's written by a white guy. Are there any did you, like, I know this story was kind of hard to read, and so I don't want to focus on this one too long because it's like, what's going on? Tina's right. He's captured. He's taken as a slave. Do you think maybe there were some biases written into this story because it's not written directly by Job himself?
Yep.
Yeah.
What gave you that indication? Like, are there any particular parts of the story that you're like, oh, or?
Well, that part from, hold on. It was,
Let me ask it this way. Is there like a difference in how this story is structured, or like what kinds of things they focus on with Job compared to like what Equiano focuses on in the next document, or Frederick Douglass? Like, are there things being left out of Job's story, in other words?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. What would be the most glaring omission? Like, what would be left out from Job's story that you think probably should be there?
Ooh. Ah, man, like, I'm sorry,
How
I can't really
bad he
think
was
right
treated
now.
on the ship.
Yeah, how bad they're treated, how bad he's treated. Like it'll
yeah.
talk. Yeah, it'll talk like about Job's sorrows a little bit, but like those things are glossed over in favor of other details that.
By the way, how old was Job by then?
I don't know. I don't think we have a really good idea.
He definitely, I mean, he could have been our age, but then again, could have been not.
Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly younger African men that are kidnapped because they're still developing, and like, why would you take, an older man as a slave? It doesn't make sense.
Easily like try to fight back.
That's true. Yeah. And last week we did talk about slave resistance. So that's the downside, is you're harvesting these black bodies for slave labor, but at the same time, they're more than capable of fending for themselves when it comes to it. Okay, so that's the first. So Job is the first slave narrative, and it doesn't come from Job himself. It comes from this white guy who writes the book on behalf of Job, and conveniently leaves a few things out of Job's experience. But then we get Ulad Equiano, which is like probably the first slave narrative that we have that's from straight from the man himself. It's straight from the mouth to the page of an actual slave who is educated and who's able to relate his story in a way that readers can read firsthand. So tell me about Equiano. Like, what's his experience, and how is it different than Job's?
His was really messed up.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like, it took me a little bit to keep reading because I was like, yeah, I can't do this. No.
Yeah. What happens to Equiano in this story?
He was
And then his
kidnapped from
sister.
his neighborhood.
Sorry, Lizzie, go ahead.
He was kidnapped from his neighborhood at 11.
Yeah. Yeah, he's kidnapped from his village in West Africa from a really young age. People jump over the wall and just kidnap him and his sister. And like, it's like, holy crap. Like just one night, his life is completely changed. Tina, were you also saying something?
Yeah, I was gonna say he was kidnapped, and then they like forced his sister away from him, and then like he would starve himself and refuse to eat because he didn't want to.
Yeah. Yeah. This is like this awful. So
This
it's
was
the
more
story,
common.
firsthand account of this awful experience that this guy has. He's just living his life in Africa, and then he's taken away. He and his sister are stolen away, and he tries to
He's at
escape
11
this.
years of age. That's pretty messed up.
Yeah. It's incredible. You don't really get this from the Job. Like you don't have this like full nose like focusing on the excruciating experience of what it's like to be ripped away from your home at an early age in the Job story. But Equiano puts the spotlight right on there, and he's like, you know what? This freaking sucks. Like my life is shitty because let me tell you about my experience as a slave. And you don't get that from the Job thing, right?
This one, it's more effective because it's like from a first-hand experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Equiano is one of the
Hold on, sorry.
no worries. Equiano's experience is one of like the first and the most. We just don't get a lot of firsthand experiences from slaves for obvious reasons. You know, they're held in bondage. They're not allowed to like sit down and talk with like an interviewer. You know, about their experience. They're not writing things down because oftentimes they don't know how to read and write in English. And so Equiano's account is super valuable to tell us like what was it like to be ripped away from, you know, your home and brought across the ocean. What other kinds of details does Equiano focus on? So Tina, you mentioned the slave ship in the last document. What kinds of things are happening on the passage from Africa to America in Equiano's story?
Well, they were put on the bottom, so all the slaves lived down there, and they got sick from being like unbathed and stuff. So like a lot of the slaves were brought up on the top of the ship because they needed fresh air or they would die.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were just being brung up dead. And
okay, just a lot of suffering happening on this ship. To the slaves that are brought up to the top, what does some of them try and do, according to Equiano, to free themselves?
jump the ship.
Jumping off the side of the ship.
Yeah.
Suicide, obviously.
Yeah, suicide. They're trying to escape by way of death. Equiano says a few different times in the story, it's better to die than to live as a slave. Like, and a few different of his colleagues are able to successfully do this. They commit suicide by jumping off the ship.
Oh, common thing from that is that those who have successfully starved themselves or drowned themselves at sea, this is like probably a thing I've read about, that they believed that their spirits would return back home. Or something like that.
Okay, so in some of the religious traditions, spiritual traditions of some of these West African people groups, you know, this was not the end, that they could somehow save their souls by killing off their bodies rather than living in slavery. Okay, good. One guy, you know, Equiano talks about one person who jumps off the ship and he's caught and he's brought back and he's flogged half to death for trying to escape. These are the things that white folks living in the Americas are not learning about. Like, these are the things that Equiano is desperately trying to tell people, like, look, the slave experience is really bad. It's like, it's a nightmarish hellscape. And he's trying to relate that to his readers. Good. Yeah. So this goes forward then into more of the early modern period. Frederick Douglass writes a lot. He's one of the most famous escaped slaves of American history. You've probably heard the name Frederick Douglass at some point along the line through your education. So Frederick Douglass does a lot of writing. He gives a lot of speeches. The document that I asked you to read for this week from Frederick Douglass is from a speech that he gives in Massachusetts in the 1840s after he's escaped from the South to the North. What kinds of things does Frederick Douglass focus on as he's giving this speech to an audience of white people in the North? What does he talk about?
Like slaves would learn on their own, but keep it a secret because it was illegal to teach slaves anything.
Okay.
Which was bullcrap, if you ask me.
Yeah. Clandestine learning,
yeah.
secret study groups, basically, of slaves who are trying to learn how to read so they can, have an advantage. Yeah. What other things does Douglass focus in on in his slave narrative?
Crap.
In other words, what is he trying to get across to his audience of white folks?
That slavery should be banned for good.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, he's an abolitionist, and he's talking to other folks trying to convince them to become abolitionists in the United States and say, like, look, this is a nightmare that people live through. Specifically, I want to hone in on I'm going to see if I can find it really quickly, but in the first paragraph, Douglass, and this kind of attitude is mirrored in a lot of Black voices today, talking about the African American experience in the United States in the modern era, right? He goes like, I've come to tell you something about slavery because I know of it. I felt it. When I came to the North, I was astonished to find abolitionists, knew so much about slavery. But though they can talk about slavery's history, they can't depict its horrors. They can't speak as I can from experience. They can't refer you to a back red with scars, but I can. Like he's saying, like, look, you can talk all you want about the horrors of slavery, but I can actually tell you about the lived experience of a slave. And it's worse than you know.
A lot worse.
A lot worse. This isn't a question I asked you on the document, the guided readings here, but is there anything that resonates there with you as Americans living in the year 2020?
The fact that even today we can't understand the experience a African American person goes through when they're being pulled over by the police, or just something as simple as that. We can't understand the fear and the injustice that they feel as white people. Still, after how many years of
kills.
Hello?
Oh, you're cutting out, Jacob.
Guys, hear me?
A little bit.
A little.
Try again.
I'm gonna.
Again, this is the challenges of a Zoom class. Okay, anybody else? I heard lots of other voices. What kind of things are echoed in the modern era from Frederick Douglass writing about this? What resonates with you guys?
Well, what's still a problem today? Like, the lynching stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
Well, the modern form of lynching is obviously police brutalities. Since they can no longer hang us, and said, "Why not shoot us down?" Okay. Yeah, that turns out not to end up being well at all.
So oppressive.
Also,
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Also, like slaves have literally been beaten up a lot, and that resonates to the 1991's Rodney King beating, which is just it's still pretty messed up. But then again, like there were like people up north, especially up in Canada and like the northern United States, slavery was basically illegal up there. So like what's to now today, like most people from up north like despises everything was even a thing.
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on this? Like, what do these documents tell us about the present? How do they relate to us now?
I kind of feel like it shows that unfortunately we still are dealing with a lot of the same problems today that we dealt with back then, and there's still an issue of communication, and there's still an issue of understanding, and there's still people who are ignorant, and there's still people who don't fully understand. I feel like the problem is just some people, it's really hard for them to address a problem when they don't think there's a problem, or when they don't really understand that there's a problem.
Yep.
Yeah. People don't really understand there's still a problem. That describes it pretty well.
As much as said, like it may seem like everything is doing much better, we still got a long way to go.
The discrimination is still there. It's just way more subtle. Okay. Though it's not really that subtle.
It's not even always. Racism evolved.
Okay.
It's a lot more subtle than it was in the 1800s.
Yeah, it's taken different forms. You know, as Josh says, you know, public lynchings have now evolved into police brutality, where
essentially, yeah.
You know, the hand of justice still falls down heaviest on people of color, but instead of you know, for the most part, instead of a white lynching mob, it's now taken by agents of the state in different ways, and that's problematic, to say the least. Isaac's you know, pointing out something too, about like talking to the audience of white abolitionists. Like in the North, there's a minority movement among whites in the North in the 1800s, before the Civil War, that they wanted to see the end of slavery because they thought it was abhorrent. But abolitionism was not ever like a majority movement. Like I think a lot of whites in the North just didn't really care that much about what was happening in Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina. And so, but there's still this kind of growing movement. And Isaac's doing well, I think, in the chat to draw attention to the fact that Frederick Douglass is trying to give another angle to what the abolitionists in Massachusetts, for instance, think they know about slavery, but a lot of them have never met a slave or a former slave. They've never talked to perhaps even a black person before about their experiences.
What was it like? Yeah.
So Frederick Douglass is absolutely instrumental in widening that abolitionist movement in the antebellum North, in the years before the Civil War. And Isaac is right to point that out. Absolutely. So yeah, he focuses on the pain, the real experience of being beaten, the unfairness, the lack of justice that happens in the slaveholding South. And he brings that message up north. So, okay, the last document then, Leonard Black. How does his narrative different than that of Frederick Douglass? What does he focus on? What is he trying to say?
He's a child. He's kind of telling the experience of like being he's just completely alone.
Yeah. Yeah. alone. Any other perspectives on the Leonard Black document? It's not as like flashy and like, you know, emotionally charged as Frederick Douglass's, but what kinds of things does he focus on?
He focuses on the brutality he had to face as a child. Like, each time he switches owner, it gets worse and worse because he's being hit and abused so much.
And like, it's like really messed up when I've read it. It was just, it made me want to go back in time and just like grab a, well, okay, I wouldn't say go there, but it did make me want to mess them up. But it's not that simple.
You know, it's really hard to read these accounts where there's just a complete lack of justice and a complete lack of equity between people. Like, you know, we've come so far, and yet we're still really far away from achieving equity and justice. And it's hard to read about the period where like the stuff is it's just okay. It's just okay to like beat up, you know, Black people for literally no reason at all, or for Black children to have to suffer. And yet that still happens in a lot of areas.
Yep.
So, any other thoughts on anybody else has that you want to point out from reading these documents? Any other reactions you might have had to these?
Well, I was pretty shocked when I read. Oh crap! What was his name? He had a Spanish name. Oh yeah, Equiano.
Equiano.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
His one I just couldn't even bear to read most of the time. Yeah. But I already knew about Africans selling other Africans. But like what shocked me the most, that they sold children out of all people. And it's like, why children?
Yeah, there's a lot of heartbreaking answers to that question. It's really, yeah, it is hard to read. Children are more malleable, they're more vulnerable. You know, you can start them up from a younger age in forced labor. There's all kinds of talk about breeding programs that happen in the South, and it's messed up, as you say. Yeah. Any other kinds of reactions that you had while reading these? Okay, so then that brings us to another thing I wanted to talk about before we go, which was I hope you all got to read the reaction by Snoop Dogg. This was an article 4 years ago. About 4 years ago, there was this is when Black Lives Matter first kind of started gearing up as a movement. It's when it had a name put to it. This was in the aftermath of a lot of killings of Black men, Tamir Rice and Freddie Gray, and all kinds of things, riots in Baltimore and Ferguson. So in that kind of cultural environment, then there's a lot of movies and TV shows that are produced and released to the public about depicting things from a slave's perspective. In other words, it's a kind of a Hollywoodized slave narrative that you would find in Frederick Douglass or Ulad Equiano or any of the documents that we read, but it's put on the big screen. Snoop Dogg has thoughts on this, and what were some of his reactions, I suppose, to this Hollywoodization of slave narratives?
Well, I haven't read it yet, so I can't really say anything about it.
I feel like well, I don't know, because I haven't read it yet either, but I feel like he might not have necessarily liked the Hollywoodization part of it.
Yeah, he ends up saying, you know, why are we focusing so much on the past and on these slave narratives? Like they're just going to drill this into our heads over and over and over, of course slavery is bad. But what about the present?
The ones that are happening now.
Yeah. What about the modern experience of African Americans? Or why not focus on the good things that we've done? You know, why not focus on the amount of, you know, rights that have been gained, or, well, he doesn't explicitly say rights or economic advantage or things like that, but he's like, what about the progress? Why don't we focus on that?
Yeah, that is something I do agree with him on that one. I mean,
okay.
It's just that most Black movies for my people I've watched, half the majority of them are hood movies, and it kind of makes me facepalm my head. It's like, why can't there be any one of them that's like not hood related? I mean, other than Spike Lee's movies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think Snoop has a point about this, or what are your thoughts on this?
I think Snoop makes a valid point because it's not giving any attention to what's happening today. And if they do, they're just using it to make a profit. They're not doing it to like advocate. Like who I forgot her name. The girl that was killed by the police with 50 shots. They made a movie about her and just used it to make profit. They didn't really advocate about her life and all that.
Wasn't this from Chicago, or was that something different?
It might have been. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, when I first heard of that, I literally almost had a complete meltdown.
Yeah. Okay. So he's got a point. Anybody else? What are your reactions to, you know, this attitude of like, why can't we just break away from, you know, past slave narratives, or is it worth retelling the story of slavery over and over and over?
Honestly,
I think
you
the
guys go
Hollywood
ahead,
part of it is kind of crummy because Hollywoodization of anything, like Logan said, is to make money, and rather than putting it in a not fictitious, but like they should do something that's actually productive and teaches historical lessons in the most realist way possible, rather than making it so people consume it and enjoy it and think it's, oh, that was a good movie, rather than, oh, that was a really deep lesson that taught me a lot about America. Like, I feel like those kinds of movies, you should come out of them like not necessarily not enjoying them, but be.
Mm-hmm. I think I get what you're saying. It should be more informative, less entertainment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From my point of view, from Snoop Dogg's thing, is that we've been making movies about slavery over and over and over for like at least 20 to 30 years from now. I mean, well, make that 20 to 40 years. Like since the first one, Roots was the first, which was I think was the first one.
Yeah.
But then the recent one is like 12 Years as a Slave. I've seen that one when I was 17. Not exactly a good age to see that because I was a very, very angry person at that time. So seeing 12 Years as a Slave just made me felt even more anger on America from back then. I mean, I don't have that anger as much as I do now, but at the same time, it's kind of understandable when you're like, when there's no movies that's talking about like the recent history of African Americans. And it's kind of frustrating because it's like, okay, when are we gonna stop making this slave stuff over and over again? Can we at least do the ones about, you know, us modern African Americans? So like, it is understandable.
Yeah, thanks for the perspective, Josh. Brody, were you gonna say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say, Hollywood. I feel like Snoop Dogg. I can kind of see where he's coming from because Hollywood kind of has. It's always kind of had an issue of exploiting tragedies, and it's like whenever there's people who are profiting and making money off of something horrible, not just slavery, but maybe like a movie like Schindler's List about the Holocaust, or just any major tragedy, any sort of natural disaster. It's kind of like they're exploiting it in some way. People's suffering.
Yeah, 9/11 or
the
something.
Hiroshima bombing of Japan.
Yeah.
Like every single thing that's been happening in this world. Like they make movies out of it. And what they need to do is make sure that speak to the people who actually lived through that instead of just making profit out of it and just make money.
Well, that's the other side of the coin that I wanted to ask about was like, don't like shows like Roots or, you know, Django Unchained or 12 Years a Slave. Aren't those also educational in some way? Like, because it shows the tormented experience of what it's like to live as an African American in the United States.
Yeah, pretty much.
I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here. Is it worth it?
I would say that it does have some educational value. As the article did say, it's usually just forward thinking. They don't really dive deep into it, like how dark and like despair like they felt. It just like smoothed it over a little bit.
Yeah,
and
yeah, it did kind of felt that way. But then again, if they did it a little bit too far, I'm pretty sure there will be kids who accidentally might watch that movie and be traumatized as hell.
Yeah, that's fair. Jacob?
I don't know if anybody has ever seen Schindler's List.
I've seen it. It's messed up.
The way it's World War II and the Jewish people in internment camps and all that, and it's very brutal. It's very real and shocking, and it's in black and white. It's really highly stylized to show you the real grit and terror that everybody felt, and if they and a show like that would be Roots. The way they did Roots was and how real it felt, how emotionally invested you were in the people there because of the way the show showed you everything that went on.
Yeah.
I think if more movies and more Hollywood things were to do that direction, I feel like that would be better for the American people so they can understand.
It'd be the same with me with 12 Years as a Slave. When I first saw that movie, it made me understood what slavery was really, really like. Now, I've read books about it and read the horrible atrocities, but after watching that movie, it just made me just thought, man, America has been fucked up ever since. But the one thing I really wish they did is make a movie about how Native Americans were literally being brutalized and like the genocide of Native people, because I feel like for them, as much as we are, but that's the one thing that angers me is because they were here first. They lived here for centuries long before any of us did, and there's no movie about what they've gone through. And it's like, oh, come on, Hollywood, what the? But yeah.
Yeah, I can't recall any movie that's based on the Trail of Tears, you know, or Indian removal programs to reservations in Oklahoma or something like that. Yeah. So in other words, there are narratives in American history that don't get their fair due in the realm of entertainment and Hollywood. And when it is, it's kind of profit-seeking behavior on the part of studios and producers. I can get behind that view. I thought it was interesting because, you know, Snoop raises some really good points about, you know, it's almost like so much focus on slave narratives detracts attention away from the present experience of African Americans. And it's kind of insane how we keep getting these stories about literal slavery but not stories about police brutality or marches for justice, unless it has something to do with Martin Luther King. But even then, that's been done to death.
That's been 60 years from now.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's still technically 50, but like soon it'll be 60.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I hope this was a constructive talk and kind of gets the gears turning. But any other thoughts before we go from anyone else that wanted to say something on this topic? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Well, I got nothing to say, so.
Josh, you have great things to say. I very much appreciate having you in this class. So, okay. Well, that's it for today. Next week, we'll be discussing a different topic altogether, how the legal system in the United States has been built up over time to essentially, there's a lot of talk about systemic racism going on right now for good reason. And I'll probably...
which page is on? Is that on?
What pages is this going to be? It's on the course schedule, but it's chapters 2 and also drawing a little bit from chapters 3 and 4 as well. So I think there are 8 documents in total, seven documents to read across 3 different chapters. And all of them have to do with the codifying of racism within the American legal system, which is something that we're dealing with still in the modern era, because law is a very problematic thing when it comes to talking about justice and equality, and especially the African American experience. So that's going to be our topic for next week. I will try and get your papers graded as soon as possible. I hope to have them done by the end of the weekend. I have 100 students this semester, and it's hard to grade all the stuff in a timely manner. So please be patient with me as I grade your first essay. What I've seen so far, it looks great, but I hope to get those done soon. So we have another paper due by the end of next Friday, and that will be dealing with this week's discussion and also next week's discussion and documents. Just a clarifying thing, when I send you these questions relating to the documents, you do not need to fill them out and send them to me. These are from note-taking purposes only, and for discussion, for orienting the discussion on Wednesdays. But it does help to read the documents before the discussion. I'll just say that, so that we can keep on trucking with our learning here. Any other questions before we get going?
No.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your week. I'll see you next week, and thanks for a good talk today.
Okay. See ya.
All right. Bye, everyone.